All right, so in your next class, you have to talk about IELTS speaking, but where do you start? Well, I was in exactly the same situation only a few years ago. I didn't know anything about the IELTS, but since then I've learned a lot, and there are two things that really helped me. The first thing was, well, talking to colleagues, because I always learn a lot from talking to other teachers. But the second thing was just learning the format of the IELTS speaking test. Luckily enough, that's what we're going to do today. So let's get into it. Hi guys, my name's Phil and welcome to this channel. So today we're going to be talking about the speaking test for IELTS and the format. Now this is really kind of directed at teachers, but if you are a student and you've stumbled across this video, stick around because you're going to find it useful. Hey, and if it's your first time watching me, why not subscribe and hit that notification bell? Okay guys, let's get into it. Now the IELTS speaking test, it lasts from 11 to 14 minutes. And it's actually split into 4 parts. Wait, did I just say 4 parts? Isn't it 3? No, it's actually 4 parts. So yes, there is part 1, there's part 2, and there's part 3, but there's also something we call part 0. So part 0 is really the administration part of it, the introduction with the examiner, and then part 1, which lasts from 4 to 5 minutes, is like an interview about familiar topics for the student. Part 2, the student is given a prompt and they have to talk about it for about 2 minutes, and that takes anywhere between 3 and 4 minutes to get through that part. Part 3 is again 4 to 5 minutes, and it really talks about abstract ideas, but the topic is always connected to part 2. So that's how it's broken down. But let's talk about this in a bit more detail, because if you really understand it and you understand what the examiner is expecting from you, well, you can pass that information on to your students and they're going to have a much better speaking test and a much better result, hopefully. So part 0, this is when the student walks into the room and they meet the examiner. So this is what you should tell your students. First of all, they will meet the examiner face to face. There will only be one examiner and one student. So this is a lot different from FCE, for example. So it's a face-to-face, one-on-one examination. The other thing you should tell them is that they should follow the examiner's instructions. So they will walk in and they will be invited to sit down. Then they will be asked a series of questions. One of them will be for them to provide their ID and to prove who they are. Now, I know that a lot of examiners have a pet peeve, which is the student walks into the examination room holding their ID in their face. They don't like that. So tell your students to follow the instructions they're given. It will go much more smoothly. The other thing is they should expect that it is recorded, so that the examiner, they may give a band score, but if they give a band score that's a lot different to the other band scores given for the other 3 parts of the test, then someone's going to mediate, they're going to double check that. So it will be recorded. And the other thing is that they will be, as I said, expected to prove their identity. So they should give their name as it appears on the passport, and they will also be asked to give the name they want to be referred to in the test. So you should practice all of these things with the student, because they don't want to waste time here. They don't want to waffle on. They don't want to tell the examiner about their life story. Although this is part of the exam, it's not really the most important part of the exam. So they want to get through this as quickly as possible, as smoothly as possible. It's just a formality. So part 1, as I said, it takes about 4 to 5 minutes, and it's really based on an interview type situation where the examiner is talking about familiar topics that the student will probably know how to talk about. And it's kind of split into 3 different sets of questions. Now, each set will have somewhere between 4 and 6 questions. It really depends from year to year. But the first set of questions is always going to be the same. It's going to be on one of 2 main topics, either work and study or home. So the examiner will ask the student a question like, do you work or study? And if they say, currently I'm a student, they will ask the questions about being a student. If they say, I'm actually working at the moment, they're asked questions about work. So it will be either work or study or questions on home life, things based around the home. Now, a tendency that a lot of students have is they know that these questions are coming up, so they practice them to death and they have really great answers and they spend 4 or 5 minutes just talking about that. Now, if the examiner thinks you've memorized any answers, this will not count for the exam. So you've got to teach your students to give fairly short answers, but they should be as long as they need to be. And it's really important that the students get on to the other 2 sets of questions, because they can start showing the examiner they're familiar talking about unfamiliar topics. And because the first topic is always the same, the other 2 sets will be more unfamiliar. So I mentioned the length of the answers. So my general tip to students is you should be making a main point and backing up with 1 to 2 supporting sentences. So for example, you make, the question was something along the lines of, what don't you like about your neighborhood? You might say, I really don't like the heavy traffic, and then give a reason. This is because it makes it very difficult to find parking. And then you might go on and make another point. But you wouldn't talk about that topic for half an hour, obviously. So this brings us on to part 2, which I think is pretty difficult, even for a native. And the most difficult thing here is developing ideas, coming up with ideas in a short amount of time and really connecting them well. So when the student gets into the part 2 part of the test, they will be given a prompt, so a topic to talk about, often describing an experience or something like this. They will be given a pen and paper, and the examiner will give them 1 minute to prepare. After 1 minute, they will ask them to start talking, and they have to talk for 1 to 2 minutes. Now, the examiner will also, when time starts running out, they will give the students some sort of signal that the time is coming to an end. Now, this really depends on the examiner. I think many of them will clear their throat, or maybe a hand gesture or something. They'll do something kind of to help the student normally. If they don't do this, they will just interrupt the student either after 2 minutes or after they've gone over the 1 minute threshold and maybe they've stopped talking for several, 20, 30 seconds. So you can tell your students it's absolutely okay to be interrupted by the examiner. This is fine. Now here's the thing. The examiner will ask the student 1 to 2 questions based on what the topic of part 2 was. What they're trying to say to the student basically is, okay, it's time to shut up now. We're moving on to part 3. So you can tell your students that this is the only question that they can give a very, very short answer to, because literally just a transition, just going from part 2 to part 3. So part 3 is always going to be on the same topic as part 2, and there will be different sets of questions, but they will be more abstract. They're going to be a little bit more in depth. Therefore, the questions that the students have to give should also be a little bit more in depth. They really need to extend their answers, but not to waffle on. So this is a skill that you need to teach them, how to really make a main point and support it well. And the biggest difficulty that many students have is coming up with our answers here. So coming up with the answers is really not that easy when you don't know the question, when you've never thought about the question before. So it's okay for them to kind of say things to give them a bit more time. What I mean by that is phrases like, that's an interesting question, or, let me think about it for a minute. It's best to kind of teach them how to do this, to show the examiner that, okay, the student has understood the question, they're just thinking of the answer. This will not count against them as hesitation. So an interesting thing is that the students can actually ask the examiner 3 questions. They can ask the examiner to repeat a question. They can ask the examiner to clarify a question or to clarify vocabulary. They can also ask the examiner to rephrase a question. These are called the golden 3 questions. Well, maybe that's what I call them. So the thing is, until recently, now the rules are changing, they have changed possibly this year. Until recently, if the student asked the examiner to repeat the question, That is the only thing that they could do. They could not then go and ask them to clarify the same question. So it's best to teach your students that if they don't understand the question, don't ask the examiner to repeat it, ask them to clarify it. If they don't understand a word, again, they should ask them to rephrase it or to clarify it. If they just didn't hear it, that's when they ask them to repeat it. Okay, so this is the IELTS speaking test, the basic format. And if you know this like the back of your hand, you can really help out your students. The only other thing that you need to check out is the band score descriptors. So for each band score, the speaking test is graded in 4 different ways. So the 4 different criteria, fluency and coherence. So this is basically how comfortable the student is at speaking about these topics and how well they are to understand. Lexical resource, using vocabulary in the right way. Grammatical range and accuracy, using a combination of simple and complex grammar. And then pronunciation. So for each band score, there are certain things that the student has to do in order to get those. I recommend you go through and have a look at that. There's a link in the description. They're not that easy to find, these public band score descriptors, so I've put that in the description for you. Go and check those out, and there will be a future video where we talk about each band score in a little bit more detail. Okay guys, thanks so much for watching. If you're not a subscriber already, why not become one right now? Hit that notification bell. There's plenty more videos coming out, and they're all aimed at helping you become the best IELTS teacher that you can possibly become. My name's Phil, and you've been watching The English Grind. I'll see you next time.